to be here as part of the celebration of Carl's award. His book is absolutely wonderful. Congratulations, Carl. It's really great to be part of that. I have been thinking about chance my entire career. And I actually, as I was preparing for this, I looked back at an email exchange that I had with Carl 10 years ago about chance, where he was responding to some ideas that I had published in one of my very first papers. And what's interesting in some ways is that there was some distance between our views at that time, and that distance is still there. So I have a very different approach to thinking about chance in the world than Carl does. But I think that there's also been real progress, both in his view and in my own, and it's still really illustrative to understand both of those views by kind of comparing them to each other. So here's the plan for what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about some key features of Humean objective chance, which I'm assuming most people here know is the view about chance that Carl puts forward in Chance in the World. Then I'm going to focus on explanation. This is the aspect of chance that I have been especially interested in, and that is a little bit harder to deal with when you're approaching things from Carl's perspective. So I'm going to talk about chancy explanation as a desiderata and why the Humean objective chance view has difficulty with chancy explanation. And then I'm going to sort of give some of the background for why I think that this approach to think about chance is so important. So I'm going to give a naturalistic argument for chancy explanation and talk about some of the consequences that happen if you try to resist that naturalistic argument. And then at the end, I'll say something about what I see as the kind of core tension here. Okay, so here are some of the key features of the Humean objective chance view. First and foremost, so these are coming almost verbatim out of Chance in the World. Chances are constituted by the existence of patterns in the mosaic of events in the world. Chances arise at various levels, and higher level chances, at least, arise in multiple ways. So one of the things, so what Carl says about this, I have some of the quotes here in my speaker notes. He says that some stable macroscopic chances are explicable as regularities that are guaranteed by the structure of the assumed chance setup, but also that the right sort of stability and randomness in an outcome distribution just by itself, as long as it's overall history and for a well-defined chance setup, is usually enough to constitute an objective chance. So sometimes with the higher level chances, you can see how they are generated from below. In other cases, it's just you observe the pattern there. And that's enough to constitute the chance. It's also the case, and this is a departure from other sort of frequency accounts of chance. Carl says that setups that have few actual outcomes, but the right sort of similarities to other sorts of setups, having clear objective chances, can themselves be ascribed objective chances. Then these two bullet points are, in some ways, I think the ones that are most important to Carl and really driving a lot of the work. The patterns are such as to make the adoption of credences identical to chances rational in the absence of better information. So the core idea here is that we can get a justification for the principal from this metaphysics of chance. And what unifies all of the chances, remember, because you can get chances in different ways, is their ability to play this role of guiding credence. So, so as I said, I think that these two ideas are really core to understanding chance in Carl's book. What I think this view demonstrates is a core tension between two roles that we might have in mind, or that we might have initially ascribed to chance and we might be sort of focused on as we start our investigation into what chances are. On the one hand, like Carl, you might be really interested in the idea that chances guide credence. On the other hand, like me, and as I'm going to demonstrate here, you might be really interested in the idea that chances explain relative frequencies. And I'm not going to try even to argue for one of these over the other so much as just demonstrate that there is this kind of core tension. So if you start from the Humean objective chance perspective, it's really hard to capture explanation. I think the vice versa is true, but this is, I'm going to mostly focus on that direction in the talk today. All right, so let's talk about why we might want chances to play an explanatory role. So this is tritium decay. So tritium is decaying into helium. It's an example of radioactive decay. Plausibly, this is a fundamentally indeterministic process, although there are ways of, there are interpretations of quantum theory where you can get it to be deterministic, but at the very least, it's an open possibility that this is indeterministic at the fundamental level. Most physicists, I think, would say something even stronger than that, that it's very likely to be indeterministic. On your right, you have the decay curve for tritium. So what we see here is the percent of tritium that is left after a certain time period. You can get things like the half-life from that curve. What I want you all to observe is just that the vast majority of tritium will decay by 100 years. I'm going to use that as an example. You can see that from the decay curve there. Okay, so here are some things that you might explain using a statement about chance. First, for some particular tritium atom, why did that atom decay within 100 years? Answer, potentially, because the chance of any particular tritium atom decaying within 100 years is close to 1. That's one way you might want to use chance to explain a fact about the world. You can also say the same kind of thing, but for larger samples. So for some particular large sample of tritium atoms, why did most of those atoms decay within 100 years? Again, because the chance of any particular tritium atom decaying within 100 years is close to 1. And then you can also extrapolate from claims about particular large samples that you may have observed to a more general pattern in the world itself, which is this question here. So why is it that most tritium atoms decay within 100 years? And again, you might try to explain this using a claim about chance. You might say, because the chance of any particular tritium atom decaying within 100 years is close to 1. So again, the thing to emphasize that I want to emphasize now that I said before is that it is standard, though not required, to think of this kind of decay as a fundamental indeterministic process. And what that means is that the chancy explanations just cited are the only available explanations. So we cannot explain facts about tritium decay by pointing to the initial state of the system, because the initial state can produce decay events, and it can also produce non-decay events. The very same initial state can do that. Okay? So because of that, in that these fundamental indeterministic laws, right? It's very hard to avoid the kinds of chancy explanations that I just gave. It's always available to you to not go for an explanation at all, but there isn't an alternative explanation readily in the offing. Again, if you want to take a Bohmian account of quantum theory, then you can potentially explain these in an alternative way, but I'm just going to set aside that possibility for the discussion here because I don't think we want to build our metaphysics of chance on that assumption at the very least. Okay, so why does Humean objective chance have trouble with chancy explanation? It's right in the very first idea that I talked about, or that I presented from Carl's book. So the worry is that according to the fan of Humean objective chance, chances are constituted by the existence of patterns in the mosaic of events in the world. There's going to be some tension there between using chance to explain, in particular, patterns of events in the world. This is building on a familiar worry that more often arises in the context of metaphysics of laws. So here's Tim Maudlin worrying about Humean accounts of laws. that have a very tight relationship between the laws and patterns of events in the world, the regularities in the world that we associate with those laws. Maudlin says, if one is a Humean, then the Humean mosaic itself appears to admit of no further explanation, since it is the ontological bedrock in terms of which all other existent things are to be explicated. None of these further things can really account for the structure of the mosaic itself. This complaint has been long voiced, commonly as an objection to any Humean account of laws. If the laws, this is kind of the key bit, if the laws are nothing but the generic features of the Humean mosaic, then there is a sense in which one cannot appeal to those very laws to explain the particular features of the mosaic itself. The laws are what they are in virtue of the mosaic rather than vice versa. Okay, so this is the objection as it applies to laws, but there's going to be similar objection as it applies to chance. So here's the first pass at the objection. There's going to be different kind of gradations depending on how you want to go in response to the worry. So why does the fan of Humean objective chance have trouble with those kinds of chancy explanations I introduced earlier at a first pass? Simply because nothing can explain itself. So if the chance of any particular tritium atom decaying just is the relative frequency with which tritium atoms decay, then the chance of any particular tritium atom decaying cannot explain that relative frequency, because they are the same thing. Sometimes Humeans, in response to this kind of concern, and I think it's an open question, the extent to which a fan of Humean objective chance on Carl's model really wants to take this route, but I'll go through it just in case. Sometimes Humeans want to kind of push some space in between what they take chances to be and the relative frequencies in order to avoid this objection. So they're going to say, well, maybe chances aren't just relative frequencies. There's a tight relationship, but the relationship is not identity. It's still going to be the case, and I take it that this is just part of what it is to be a Humean, that chance, I said electron here instead of tritium, sorry about that. I'm mixing up my examples. The chance of any particular tritium atom decaying is grounded, at least partly, in the relative frequency with which tritium atoms decay. Okay, so the idea here is that even if there is an identity between the chance and the pattern grounds the chance. Therefore, for the Humean, the chance of any particular tritium atom decaying is going to be explained, at least partly, by the relative frequency with which tritium atoms of that sort decay. Okay, that grounding explanation tracks these kinds of grounding facts. And what that means is that the chance of any particular atom decaying cannot also explain the relative frequency with which tritium atoms decay. Again, sorry for the mix-up on the slides. So here's the idea. We've got a kind of circularity. Even if we don't have something explaining itself, we have a kind of circularity in explanation that looks problematic. So we've got the relative frequencies in the Humean mosaic. Those are explaining the Humean objective chances because they ground the Humean objective chances. And then the Humean objective chances are in turn explaining the relative frequencies in the Humean mosaic. There are two relatively standard ways of avoiding this kind of circularity objection that are available to the fan of Humean objective chance. So the first is to give up that grounding analysis of Humeanism that I suggested here. The second is to allow for the circle of explanation, but argue that there are sort of importantly different types of explanation available. So in the first objection, or the first response, you just take out the top arrow here. So you say, nope, whatever I meant by my Humeanism, I didn't mean that the relative frequencies ground the Humean objective chances, and therefore they don't explain the Humean objective chances, and therefore I don't have a circle. Okay. The question for anyone who is a fan of this view is just, what does it mean to be a Humean if you don't think that that the Humean objective chances are what they are in virtue of the relative frequencies being what they are. Okay. So this might get you out of the objection, seems to undermine the motivation for the view to begin with. A second move that you might make, and this builds on an idea from a paper of Barry Lauer's, is to say that, yes, there is a circle here, but it is a non-problematic circle because the kind of explanation that's involved changes as you navigate the circle. So the relative frequencies in the Humean mosaic ground the Humean objective chances. The Humean objective chances scientifically explain the relative frequencies in the Humean mosaic, and their scientific explanation is something importantly different than grounding. And so there isn't any concern about the circle any longer. Okay. So what I take myself to show here is that there's a kind of, at least at first blush, there's a real tension for the Humean between, for the fan of Humean objective chance in giving any kind of chancy explanation facts. I've showed how we might develop that objection in a little bit more detail if we get more sophisticated in the kind of back and forth with the Humean. I think that Alison, who will be our second speaker today, is going to talk more as well about how Humeans might get sophisticated in response to these kinds of concerns. It is also possible to just step away from those chancy explanations that I focused on at the beginning to begin with, and not make that a sort of core part of your theory. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to argue against that move, and I'm going to try to give a positive argument for the idea that we really need those chancy explanation facts. The argument is going to be a naturalistic argument. So this is building on a recent book that I published on naturalism, different types of naturalism, and the justification for different types of naturalism. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a naturalistic argument for a particular principle that is going to, that I'm going to claim establishes that you can't just ignore chancy explanation. So the principle is what I'm going to call the pattern explanation principle. It's going to get more sophisticated, but as a first pass, and it's fine if you just remember this one, the pattern explanation principle just says that well-established patterns cannot be left without an explanation. And as I talked about earlier, unless you take a somewhat non-standard approach to foundations of quantum theory, there isn't an alternative to chancy explanation in cases like the tritium decay case. So if you were to just say, fine, my metaphysics of chance is in tension with using chances as explanations in that kind of case, you would be in violation of this principle. I haven't said yet why that will be bad, but that's what I'm going to do now. And in particular, I'm going to argue that it isn't just sort of like, well, you could use the pattern explanation principle as a starting point, or you could start with something else, like some particular commitment with respect to your metaphysics. I'm going to argue that the pattern explanation principle really trumps other kinds of considerations, and in particular, it trumps what I'm going to call various kinds of metaphysical scruples. So I take it that this is a common motivation for Humeanism, is that you don't want certain kinds of entities in your metaphysics. That's what I mean by a metaphysical scruple. And so what I'm going to claim is true of the pattern explanation principle is that well-established patterns cannot be left without an explanation, even if identifying that explanation would involve violating some kind of metaphysical scruple. All right. So to be a naturalist, on my view, is to take science as a paradigm of successful inquiry into what there is and what it's like. That's a really broad category. There are many, many types of naturalism that satisfy that definition, and I'm not going to argue that one is better than another, but I am going to try to get us to be a little bit more specific about some versions of naturalism that we might be interested in, because they will then have further consequences. There's an especially big division, and this is the focus of a lot of my work in the book, between naturalism as a view about respecting the content of our best science. So you might think of that as like what we write down in our science textbooks, what we have in our science libraries. This one's not very well organized, but that's okay. So naturalism as a view that we need to respect the content of our best science versus naturalism as a view that we need to respect the methodology that scientists follow. That's a kind of core distinction between types of naturalism. I'm going to focus first on methodological naturalism, the second kind. The idea is that philosophers who are addressing questions about what there is and what it's like ought to follow the same methodology that scientists use. Why? At a first pass, because science is a paradigm of successful inquiry into what there is and what it's like. Its methodology provides good answers to these sorts of questions, so why not make use of it? Okay, I think this is just enough to get the theory some initial plausibility. Later, I'll give a more robust argument for methodological naturalism. Now, an immediate worry that probably isn't worrying that many people in this audience is that methodological naturalism might be empty because the methodology of science consists solely of the collection and analysis of data. And the collection of analysis of data has no bearing, according to this line of thinking, on philosophical questions about what the world is like. Okay. I think this immediate worry is a mistake for two reasons. Actually, I think both the first and second sentences are false. I'm just going to focus on the first one. So in addition to the collection and analysis of data, there is also various kinds of extra empirical reasoning in science. So it's rarely, if ever, the case that there is only one theory that's empirically adequate, that's compatible with the data. And when there is more than one empirically adequate theory, scientists choose between them on the basis of various extra empirical principles. So I don't myself ascribe to this extra empirical principle, but the one that is sort of most famous in people's minds is Occam's razor, due to William of Ockham, also famous in the closing scenes of the movie Contact. If you haven't watched it, you should. So this is an example of what I mean by extra empirical reasoning, the idea that you might have more than one theory that's compatible with the data, but you would choose between them based on some kind of simplicity consideration. As we all know, that gets super complicated, super fast. All right, so what I'm going to argue is that pattern explanation principle that I introduced earlier is one of these extra empirical principles that plays a role in scientific methodology. Therefore, we as philosophers should adopt it too. Therefore, we need to make sense of chancy explanation. We can't avoid the concern that I had, that we can't just avoid the idea that chances play that kind of explanatory role that the fan of Humean objective chance has trouble with. We started 5 minutes late?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to tritium decay. When this was first observed, scientists also observed that there was an emission during the decay process. This is a beta ray, it's just an electron. And one of the things that they found really mysterious about this kind of decay, which they called beta decay, is that the total energy of the system before the decay event did not equal the energy of the system after the decay event, so the energy of the resulting helium atom and the beta ray. And there were a lot of potential explanations for why this might be the case, which were successively tested to see which one might provide the explanation. Eventually, there were really only two explanations available. One was due to Niels Bohr, who said that the conservation of energy only holds, it's only statistically valid. Okay, so it's like the second law of thermodynamics. Sometimes it's violated. This is one of those times. And this was, so this was one of the key potential explanations for the energy that appeared to be lost in beta decay. Another physicist at the time, Wolfgang Pauli, thought that that was a terrible explanation. What's interesting is that it's not really clear why he thought it was a terrible explanation, except that he just loved the conservation of energy and he couldn't imagine giving it up. So for him, the Bohr-style explanation was off the table. And for that reason, he introduced a novel particle, the neutrino, which had no charge, and at the time they thought was massless. The whole point was that he was positing a undetectable particle as an explanation of why they hadn't detected that particle yet. Okay. But that particle would carry the missing energy in beta decay and therefore save the conservation of energy in this case. Okay, so what happened here is that eventually everybody got on board with Pauli's proposal. The reason why is that even though Pauli himself thought that this was a really surprising claim to make, he famously called it a desperate remedy. They eventually collected data that ruled out the only available alternative, which was Bohr's explanation, Bohr's explanation. So here is like a very oversimplification, very simplified description of what happened in this historical case. Everybody agreed that there had to be an explanation for the pattern of energy loss and beta decay. Pauli thought that the only candidate explanation was a novel, weird, undetectable particle, the neutrino. This was a desperate remedy, but it was worth it. Why? Because the pattern explanation principle. And once Bohr's alternative explanation was off the table due to a conflict with some data that they collected, everybody else got on board too. Everybody else went through this sort of, these last 3 lines of reasoning. It's a desperate remedy, but it was worth it. Why? The thought is, this is evidence for the pattern explanation principle as a methodological principle in science. So there's other examples of the pattern explanation principle. I'm going to skip them for time. What I want to argue is that it follows from these cases that the pattern explanation principle doesn't trump empirical adequacy. So it doesn't give us a reason to posit something that's not compatible with the data, but it does trump pretty much any type of metaphysical scruple. So even if you didn't like neutrinos or undetectable particles in general, you still have to get on board with thinking that they exist if they're the only available explanation for a pattern of data that we've collected. Okay, I'm going to skip through. So I have a number of slides about thinking about different kinds of explanation here. And I know that that's a way of responding to these kinds of concerns. I'm going to skip through those slides and focus my remaining time just on the what's going to happen if you try to resist this sort of methodological naturalism. So with apologies, I'm going to skip through a bunch of stuff right here. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is what you should think if you don't like where this kind of concern, this kind of argument is headed. So is it possible to resist methodological naturalism and in doing so avoid the pattern explanation principle and the kinds of things it commits you to, including potentially giving up Humean objective chance because it can't account for chancy explanation? To see why this would have significant consequences, we can backtrack to the other kind of naturalism that I talked about earlier. So this is what I call content naturalism, the idea that philosophers ought not put forward theories about what there is and what it's like that conflict with the content of our best scientific theories. The reason for thinking content naturalism is plausible is that it really shapes all of our philosophical theorizing. So Thales thought everything was made of water. We don't take this seriously as a view anymore. We don't write papers about it. We don't discuss it. Why not? Because it is an obvious conflict with our best science. You can also see content naturalism at work in theories where the content of our best science is less clear. So one of the core arguments in debates over the metaphysics of time is whether or not some of these views are in conflict with relativity theory. Everybody involved in these debates agrees that if there is a conflict with relativity theory, that's bad. There's all sorts of creativity about trying to avoid any conflict with relativity theory, but everybody agrees that we wouldn't want a theory that so conflicts. And then the key thing that I want to emphasize is that I don't think you can be a content naturalist unless you're also a methodological naturalist. So if you have established principles like the pattern explanation principle that I showed earlier, if you have established those as part of the methodology of science, you can't just give them up because you have various philosophical concerns unless you're also willing to give up content naturalism, unless you're also willing to, in general, put forward theories that are in conflict with our best scientific theories. There's more of an argument behind that link, which again, I don't want to take too much time away from Q&A, so I won't go into too much detail here, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. The concluding thoughts that I want to give is just to emphasize again that I think there is a real core tension between two roles that you might have initially ascribed to chance. On the one hand, the idea that chances guide credences, which I think is one of the core motivations behind Carl's work and behind Humean objective chance as a metaphysical theory. And in contrast, the idea that chances explain relative frequencies, which has been a guiding idea behind the kind of discussion that I put forward today, and which might push you away from Humean objective chance as a metaphysics of chance. One thing that we might ask after thinking about the naturalistic foundations for chancy explanation is whether or not there is also a naturalistic argument for thinking that chances must play this credence guiding role. I think that's something that could be developed in more detail as a response to the kind of line that I've pushed today. And especially if the answer to this question is yes, I think we have a real, there's enough work in this area now to start to wonder whether we really have a unified concept here. So if we have two very competing, if we have two important roles that some concept is supposed to play, and those roles compete in a direct way, or a fairly direct way, as I've tried to argue here, one option is to try to say that we don't in fact have a unified concept to begin with, or if we have a unified concept, maybe it's one that doesn't emit of a unified metaphysics. So we could both be Humean objective chances, at least for some kinds of chance, and give that view up for other kinds of chance. That's a position that is at least potentially available to all of us. All right, so thanks again to Carl for such a wonderful book and to the organizers of the workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'm also delighted to be here. This is another case of praise by criticism, because I take Carl's view to be, I think for me, the most worked out, explicit, thoroughly defended Humean view. And so even though the challenges I'm going to be raising apply to other views as well, it's very nice to have a clear target for this one. And I do look forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the motivations for Humeanism, because I used to be someone who was very much in the camp of, yeah, this is the best view in town. You know, nothing else is very clear to me. Let's go this way. And then I'm going to talk about attention. And this is the first time I've presented it in this kind of form. So I'm hoping that it works in this form. But it is, for me, the reason why I kind of gave up being sympathetic. Well, I'm still sympathetic, but anyway, gave up being Humean. I'm going to relate this tension to some other problems that you may be more familiar with, talk about some of the escapes, and then draw some general conclusions for how we should go about giving accounts of charts. So I think it's nice to start with sort of a reminder in some ways about what we might want from an account of charts. So I take this list to be relatively uncontroversial. Nina's raised some interesting questions about, you know, whether we might press on some of these, but, you know, at least it seems prima facie, you know, we'd like a clear metaphysics, probably some compatibility with our best science, some relation between chances and actual events, some kind of link there of some kind, that would be good. An account of how we reason to chances and an account of how chances guide our reasoning. And I don't intend this list to be exhaustive. I would also like to have, for example, chances used in explanation and in lots of other settings, in fact. But I think if, at least to my mind, actually, if we can get the first 5 going, we're sort of most of the way there. And I'm sort of hopeful that if that works out, we can kind of extend it to these other applications. So Humean accounts, I'm sort of hoping we're mostly familiar with what this is going to mean, but we have the Humean mosaic, something like a distribution of non-modal events or states or property instantiations. And Humean accounts are just going to be all those kind of accounts that in some way reduce chances to some aspect of the Humean mosaic. There's kind of ways of summarizing the mosaic. And I'm intending to be sort of very hands-off about exactly what aspect, exactly what reduce means there. But to give some clear examples, if you have an actual relative frequency account of chance, where chances just are the relative frequencies, well, that's clearly a way of sort of summarizing some aspect of the Humean mosaic. That's what chances are doing. Under Carl's account, you have a nice development of that idea where chances are going to be relative frequencies in event sets that satisfy certain properties, such as looking chancy and having stable distributions across time and space. And sometimes you're going to have to look at nearby related setups if you haven't got enough events, but we're going to stick to relatively simple cases for the discussion today. And then you have what I'm going to call sort of generic best systems accounts, because Carl's account does use some of those aspects as well. But in this sort of more generic group of people, chances are deriving from appropriate ways of summarizing the mosaic, where we're normally talking about the whole mosaic. There's no kind of, to begin with, explicit looking at a certain kind of event or a certain kind of setup. But anyway, I'm not going to worry about a sharp distinction there. Now, on the face of it, it might seem that Humean accounts are going to do pretty well at answering those 5 desiderata. And what I'm just going to note here is that the way Humeans are reducing chances to things like summaries of non-modal events is essential for all the claimed advantages. And this shouldn't be surprising because it's kind of what it is to be a Humean view. So reduction gives us an unproblematic metaphysics and a clear one. That's great. Often compatibility with best science is also appealed to here because you can invoke kind of how we reason to chances and the kind of theories we develop as well in setting the standards for how we summarize the mosaic using our Humean reduction. And so, for example, if you want to, this is optional, but you can be permissive about some of the properties of chance. So, for example, if you wanted non-trivial chances compatible with determinism, this is one way of getting that in without having to do too much. Again, optional feature. Clear relation between chances and actual events, typically reduction. Very clear, well, clear enough relation for today. How we reason to chances, again, this is where kind of scientific or everyday standards often feature. How do we reason to what chances are? Well, we often use relative frequency information, so we can kind of get that in there. And then this has come up a few times with the principle, which is or some kind of variant, which is a principle telling us how our credences should be aligned to our beliefs in chances. The thought is we can do something like derive these principles by using something like a Humean reduction, and that other accounts of chance are going to have problems here. So this is sort of the claimed advantages. I'm not going to press too much on these, just pointing out that reduction is featuring. We're going to need this later. Secondly, and this is so that I'm not being kind of ad hominem, I think for Humeans, the account of chance just is meant to fit with how chance is used in scientific and everyday reasoning. Now, there might be room for disagreement about particular cases and how much is everyday and how much is scientific and which sciences we pay more attention to. But in general, it's not a kind of imposition to the Humean project to say that they're interested in a fit with science. I think it's often being baked in to the way they claim they're doing well here. And again, a lot of that's coming by using the standards of science and everyday practice and explaining how we get to the chances. Again, they're generated by ways of summarizing the mosaic that kind of look familiar from looking at how we actually reason to chances. Okay, good. Background. Here's where the tension's going to come in. So I'm going to take away from that the thought that Humean reduction is supposed to deliver the chances that are those used in scientific and everyday reasoning. They are meant to be the kind that kind of work in the way we expect them to, that can fit nicely into the theories we develop, that kind of work well in these kinds of contexts. So that's I'm going to call the non-revisionist claim. Okay, we're not aiming to revise science here or everyday reasoning. We are trying to deliver an account of chances that can kind of neatly slot in to the kind of way we're already using chances, again, in everyday reasoning and in science. And the tension is going to be between that and the reduction, and the claim that, again, Humean chance is reduced to some aspect of the Humean mosaic. And the reason I'm putting it in such sort of not bleak terms, but kind of clear terms, is that if this is indeed a tension, it's a pretty bad one. You know, it's not one you can get out of easily by, for example, giving up the reduction. And I think also, we'll talk about this, but I think there are costs to giving up the non-revisionism as well, in that the Humean project is going to have to sort of incur some cost if they really think that they can't actually deliver the chances used in everyday reasoning and science. Okay, so claim is both of these things can't be satisfied, and this is a worrying form of tension. So I'm going to talk through the tension with some quick examples, and we're going to start off with often the go-to example, which is an actual frequentist kind of Humeanism, but we'll consider more complicated cases. So simple chance claim, the coin has a 0.5 chance of landing heads. Great. If I'm using kind of chance reasoning in the ordinary, everyday or scientific sense, I can infer that it's possible for the coin to land heads every time. And I'm being a little bit careful here. I'm not actually talking about predictions here necessarily. It could be a hypothetical. It could be, you know, something I already know is the case. I'm not interested in actually making predictions. I'm just considering kind of what inferences follow or what can be licensed from accepting that initial chance-based claim. I think that the following can be: it's possible for the coin to land heads every time. Now, if we adopt a simple actual frequentist Humean account of chance, that inference is not going to look good. You can't make that inference. And moreover, it seems you can infer that it's in fact impossible for the coin to land heads every time. Why? Because if that were the sequence of outcomes, then the Humean chance would be different, because I have an actual frequentist account. If the coin landed heads every time, the chance of it doing so would be 1. That is, of course, incompatible with the chance of it being 0.5. So what we have here is just a very simple and direct contradiction in the kind of inferences that are licensed by a single claim, depending on whether I'm using what you might call everyday or scientific reasoning, using chances, or using a kind of, I'm not sure what label to use here, but, you know, using the Humean reduction, taking the kind of actual frequentist account seriously in governing what inferences I can make. Good. So the implications of chance claims differ under an actual frequentist account compared to using everyday and scientific reasoning. This is the tension, and this is the sense in which we seem to have either we need a revision or there's some kind of conflict here. We're going to go through 2 more quick examples to sort of, oops, that's unfortunate. Okay. Oh yeah, so this is, just to make it bold, the tension. You know, insofar as a simple actual frequentist account aimed to be non-revisionist, it's a problem, because the metaphysics of chance is licensing inferences that directly conflict with the inferences licensed by everyday and scientific reasoning, and vice versa. You know, it conflicts both ways. Good. All right. Okay. And this problem is going to generalize to more sophisticated accounts as well. So this is Carl's one. The coin has a 0.5 chance of landing heads. And I think I've got the details here, but I have apologies, I've missed some. Okay, again, everyday and scientific reasoning, I can infer that it's possible for a coin or similar object to land heads every time in these and appropriately structurally similar chance setup, assuming they're tossed many times. Okay. I've built in some additional riders here to sort of guarantee that there's going to be a Humean chance going on. But I sort of don't see the problem with that. You know, that is an inference that will be licensed using everyday and scientific reasoning, it seems. But on Carl's account, that inference is going to be bad. And indeed, one can infer something converse, namely, it's impossible for the coin or similar object to land head every time in these and appropriately structurally similar chance setup, assuming they're tossed many times. Okay? And assuming they're tossed many times is giving us the way looking to the actual relative frequencies. I built in some appropriately structurally similar chat setup in case there was something funny going on there. But either way, the claims are going to conflict. And actually need to ask Carl about this. I'm not sure what's going to happen if you have a Humean situation where the coin does land heads every time. One thing would be to say the chance is going to be 1 because we're looking to relative frequencies, but it's sort of weird to say that this is going to look like a chancy distribution because there isn't anything really to look chancy anymore. So you could argue that it's failing the stochasticity postulate, and there's no chance at all because there just isn't the kind of random variation that's required to get us a chance on Carl's view. But either way, the implications of this initial simple chance claim are going to differ under Carl's account compared to using everyday and scientific reasoning. Now you have to build in, again, a few more riders to get a kind of clear implication on the Humean side, but the initial chance claim itself is quite simple. Just going to briefly mention the sort of generic best systems account. The difficulty here is that it's quite difficult to lay out what the precise standards are going to be. And some of these have a very kind of global quality to them, and you might not want chances in this setting. Say you do, for example, you want to have a claim like the universe is overwhelmingly likely to increase in entropy towards the future, provided it is yet to reach equilibrium. And in everyday and scientific reasoning, one can plausibly infer it's nevertheless possible, very unlikely, but possible for the universe to decrease or remain stable in entropy again, or over a long period of time, even if it is yet to reach equilibrium. Typically under a best systems account, you can't make that inference, and you can infer it's impossible for the universe to do that. Why? Gets tricky here. It depends if you also adopt a best systems account of laws or not. But keeping the laws fixed, if you were to have a universe that consistently failed to increase in entropy, we'd have to change something about the probability distribution that's standardly invoked in these cases. And so from the actual probability distribution we have, we can infer that such behavior won't happen, okay? And this is directed more at the kind of, I would say, David Albert, Barry Lower style pitches, but this is just to say that the problem is a general one. It's not tied to any particular way of setting up Humeanism. It's going to be generated at every kind of type, if you like. So again, we have these conflicts between the inferences license using the Humean reductive account of what chances are and reasoning using chances as we do in everyday and science. Janan Ismail, who is one of the few people I know who sort of stated this problem very directly, she talked about sort of reasoning using the logic required to grasp what chance is. So at least on her view, this is kind of, you can't give up this everyday and scientific reasoning part. I'm not sure exactly what to call it. There's conflicts between the inferences license, but I'm just calling it the tension until we come up with a better label. So, and again, the problem here is that it seemed like we wanted to deliver the kind of chances as we use them in everyday and science, and they're not. Okay, the chances that the Humean is using have different inferential connections compared to the ones we do, again, in the ordinary scientific and everyday reasoning. So this is the tension in its kind of bleakest form. For those familiar with debates elsewhere in philosophy of chance, I'm just going to briefly talk about how it relates to other problems because of so it's not the same as the undermining or big bad bug problem, but it relates. Okay. So typically undermining problems, we're talking about undermining futures. That's important because we're considering a situation where we have that kind of history up till now, and we're considering a future history, which is such that were that to be the actual history, the Humean chances would be different from what they actually are. So this is normally taken to generate problems if we combine it with Lewis's principal. Principle said that align your credences to what you take the chances to be, given you have no kind of inadmissible evidence that overrides your use of chance reasoning. And the problem with undermining futures was that basically the tension was appearing here. You had different, if you took on board the Humean metaphysics, there were certain things you could rule out happening, the principle seemed to rule in. And so the solution, which most have adopted, is to adopt a new principle, which effectively just conditionalizes out those possible futures that are inconsistent with the Humean chances being what they are. Okay, so you just sort of say, when considering what principle I use to kind of guide my credences based on the chances, I kind of, understandably, help myself to the Humean metaphysics and cut out those possibilities that would undermine the Humean metaphysics. Now, I was so familiar with this and it didn't worry me. There's back and forth to be had over whether we should adopt Lewis's principle anyway. It's not my preferred principle. Back and forth over, whether, exactly what revision we want, what kind of new principle. But either way, like this is the way out for undermining futures. Okay. So what I want to point out is happening here, though, is that we're getting an interesting conjoining with the new principle. So the new principle is neither, strictly speaking, reasoning just based on the Humean reduction, but nor is it straightforwardly scientific and everyday reasoning. That seemed to be the principle. It's kind of both together. So we're sort of adopting the normal inferential connections that chance has in guiding our credences, but conditionalizing out those undermining futures that were pesky, that were inconsistent with the chances being what they were. So we're kind of conjoining the everyday scientific reasoning part to a Humean metaphysics. That's what's going on here. And some people have tried to motivate the new principle for everyone and say that this kind of conjoining is what we should all start with. I'm really strongly unconvinced, but I think most have been unconvinced. Hannah Abick said that the new principle is like something of a revision and therefore a cost. And it's a revision, a cost, both in terms of being in a revision and also in terms of simplicity. Because at least the principle had a very direct way of linking up the credence you should have to your beliefs in chances. In the case of the new principle, when you're conditionalizing out all those undermining futures, you need to, for example, know what the undermining futures are. So you need a very clear metaphysics of chance, and complexities in how you set up that metaphysics are now kind of infecting the kind of possibilities you get. Okay, I don't want to stay too long on this. Sorry. I'm just going to mention the other place this arose for me very briefly, and that's in the Humean attempts to so-called justify the principle. And I use inverted quotes, not because I'm skeptical as such, but just because some people take it as primitive, and what we're really doing here is showing that chance is fit to play this primitive role. And Humeans often claim a unique advantage at this point, that theirs is the only account that can even get started and can maybe even finish this project. To take a consequentialist example, you can say things on a Humean account like it's guaranteed that we'll do reasonably well to align our credences to the relative frequencies, and that's guaranteed to be close enough to the Humean chances. So this is why we're going to do well to align ourselves to the chances. It's because there's this nice close link between what actually happens and the chances, which you can't get on other accounts. And what's curious here is that this is purely metaphysical reasoning featuring. It's thought that kind of chance-based reasoning is kind of out of bounds in this context. We haven't kind of allowed ourselves it yet. And so there's unlike with the new principle, which involves both sciencey and metaphysicsy reasoning coming together, this is purely metaphysical reasoning, basically. But, when I first looked at this, and if you just sort of ask someone a question, will we do reasonably well to align our credences to the relative frequencies or the good summaries? I was always moved by the thought that, well, no, just scientifically, there's no guarantee we're going to do well. Probably we'll do well. It's not a bad idea, but it's not a guarantee in the way the Humean account seems to deliver. And this, to my mind, started to sort of undercut the advantage Humeans were claiming, because surely they didn't want to get rid of these kind of inferences that we normally get. And I was also worried, arguably there might be some kind of, I'm calling it a pragmatic inconsistency. If pure metaphysics is the way we should be reasoning using chances, then why are we justifying things like the new principle or the principle? I'll get back to that. I'm going to skip this as well, as you can raise similar issues with accounts of laws as well. My suggestion is there's some kind of unity to these problems, namely the tension that we saw earlier. There's this very deep conflict between reasoning in a Humean reductive way and reasoning with chances as we do in science every day. Again, the Humean account is directly ruling out possibilities that science rules in. So I've yet to, again, please direct me, yet to come across people addressing this tension directly. Normally it comes up within discussions of undermining or other problems, but I'm just going to have a quick check to see whether other escapes you might see elsewhere are going to work for the tension. And I suspect this is going to have to go through quite quickly, so you may have to come back to some of this later. Okay, so one thought people have had is that maybe some kind of completeness clause is required for you to make inferences using the kind of Humean metaphysics. So something like, when I said at the start, like I had to consider every time the coin is tossed, it lands heads. Is it okay for me to put in that every? Like, in ordinary circumstances, I'll never know that it's every coin toss that I've seen, or etc. And there's various responses to this, and it's going to, it always worries me when there's too many responses, but they're all compatible and all address different things. But I'm going to maybe lean on the last one, which is a point that Carl makes, which is that we can get undermining without completeness clauses. So under Carl's account, for example, if you have significant enough areas in space and time that deviate from the relative distributions elsewhere, well, you get a different Humean chance in that region. So you don't have to have a completeness clause in there in order to get the kind of undermining and the kind of tension I'm appealing to here. Okay. And there'll be other things one can say about other kinds of accounts. There's been a second line which I find kind of confusing, and I'll say why, but it's something like the fact that we're never certain of the chances is meant to somehow tell us that the principle wasn't what we should have been using, and that when we adopt a more general principle that allows us to be uncertain of the chances, we won't get this problem. So this is the kind of line that I think Ismail and Roberts are both using. The reason I've always found this confusing is that Lewis gave us that, literally the page after he gave the principle, he gave the generalized version that built in uncertainty about the chances. And as Carl again puts it quite nicely, the tension re-arises in the scope of what you're uncertain about. So even if you're splitting your credences between two different hypotheses about what the chances might be, there's going to be undermining with respect to each hypothesis. Each hypothesis about what the chance will be will rule out some futures that the chance-based reasoning would normally rule in. Now, I think there's something more going on with these responses that kind of comes out more in later work, and that is, I think Nina sort of alluded to this as well, to be a kind of half-hearted Humean. So these people think that we should very much separate how we reason to chances, which does go via the kind of Humean reduction story, from how we reason within the scope of the chance theory, so how we reason just using chances. And I have trouble seeing how, when reasoning within the scope of a chance theory, we should somehow forget the Humean reduction. It seems if it's part of what chance is, how should we just kind of forget it? And I think what comes clearer later is that the people defending this move, or at least in the case of Janan, she's not really a Humean in the typical sense, okay? What she now thinks, along with, I think, Craig Callender, is that the Humean story isn't properly thought of as a reductive story at all. It is just an epistemology about how we reason to the chances, and the chances themselves have some other kind of ontological status. So I just sort of note this to note that, like, this isn't a way for a standard Humean to get out of it, basically. This is only work if you are literally giving up the Humean reduction and therefore giving up all those claimed advantages. So I also, want to mention, I don't get this. It has sort of nice, I like pragmatism actually. So like there's lots of things I think I would like about this, but I find the ontology going on here really unclear, because these are often people who are saying they're not helping themselves to like primitive propensities. They're not having a Humean reduction, but there's somehow the Humean story is meant to like make us not worried about what chances are. And I'm just not, I don't think this is a good way out for Humean. Okay. I find this relatively quickly as well, because again, Carl has done this nicely. He considers an earlier response, which is something like, What if you give up scientific reduction and don't think you can assign chances to, the whole mosaic being a certain way, which is what a lot of Humean accounts require to deliver chance claims. And again, a lot of responses here. I'm not a reductionist of a very strong kind, but I do think we can get global propositions. But you can get, again, these local states that generate undermining under certain Humean accounts. And there's just sort of a general thing going on here, which is that Humean accounts are absolutely tied to wanting to limit the deviation between the Humean chances and the relative frequencies. That's the whole basis of them getting their story out. And they have to do that in ways that, well, they don't have to. It seems like they always do that in ways that want to take you beyond standard probability theory. And so you're going to keep getting this tension, whether you keep it at a global level or a local level, provided you're tying Humean chances to relative frequencies in a more direct way than standard probability theory, you're going to get these points of tension. So no easy escape here. I've got like 5 minutes, is that? Oh, geez, all right.
I'll deliver. 3.
Excellent, yeah, I'll try that then. 2 perspectives. This, I think, is where things are really going, and this ties back to what Nina was talking about with respect to explanation. So the thought here is that, the Humean reduction is licensing claims about metaphysical possibility. It's taking up a kind of metaphysics perspective, whereas with scientific and everyday reasoning, that concerns physical possibility. And with respect to explanation, we explain and scientifically using the blue stuff, even if the reduction is taking part in the red stuff, there's no conflict here. Okay. These things are kind of independent perspectives that don't have to be compatible, that have sort of different aims, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, I think, where the debate has gone. And I think where you're going to find some pressure coming from the other end, and this is, again, something I think I am sharing with Nina. So if I think that metaphysics and science should be continuous and compatible in a certain way, I think you're adopting both aspects of methodological and content naturalism, looking for kind of unity between the two things. And one way of characterizing this kind of unity is to think it should mirror the unity found between different sciences. Okay? And this isn't tied to like hardcore scientific reduction. I would usually try and motivate it using unification, or what Galen calls connectability. So it's ideas about tying things together in the implications and inferences you can make so that you don't get conflicts. And that same kind of unity, which is between the sciences, should also work between science and metaphysics. So a very stupid toy example, if I take a behavioral perspective on what the dog's going to do if I place food in front of its mouth, I shouldn't get a conflicting answer if I take a more kind of biochemical physical perspective and talk about like muscle tensions and chemicals in the brain. I should get the same implication for what's going to happen. And if I don't, then either one of these domains is wrong or is being applied outside of its appropriate domain. Okay. So similarly, the thought is, if we're looking for the same kind of unity, science and metaphysics had better agree on whether it's possible for the coin to land heads every time, or one of them is wrong or being applied outside its domain. You can't get these conflicts. Now, I think I'm gonna like maybe skip a little bit of this, because this just gets into puzzlement about like what's going on here. And the reason for this the ticker tape sort of red and blue thing, like the new principle, if that's sort of like the standard for how we should be reasoning using chances, this is just a weird mishmash of the kind of science and metaphysics, but it is revisionist everywhere. And I think it's going to be a cost. And it's going to be a cost, sometimes you get, okay, this is the puzzle part, which I'm going to skip over. I don't get what's going on here. But even if I did, sometimes people say, look, the difference between the principal and the new principle isn't very much. Maybe we could just revise the way chance works in science by like conditioning out the kind of Humean reductive undermining stuff. Okay. I think this is not okay for me, basically. Again, I feel that revising the principle might be okay. We can have a debate over exactly what form that should take, but revising implications of chance overall is going to be costly, both in terms of simplicity and in recovering how, chance-based inferences were supposed to work. And, maybe that's what we should do, but I just haven't seen Humeans kind of work through all the revisionist stuff that's going to have to take place here. And this is what I'm curious about. And I'm also curious about the fit with science. So the lessons, this is the conclusion. Okay, so I think the Humean reduction just is going to entail a revision in everyday and scientific chance-based reasoning, not just in credence guidance, but in all applications for chance. And even if we get the revisionism, I do want to understand how the metaphysics is supposed to match up with the science, and that it puzzles, lots of puzzles there. So the sort of happy challenge side, I think the Humean needs to sort of face this challenge head on, characterize what the revisions are and how far they spread, and therefore what relation they envisage between the scientific and metaphysics. When is metaphysical reasoning appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. From the other side, and this is my non-Humean side coming out, I think we kind of set ourselves up to fail. If I wasn't allowed to use chances in giving accounts of chance, I'm just sort of saying that we can't reason scientifically when doing metaphysics. And that to a naturalist looks really bad. So, it was often set up that the using of chance to give an account of chance was going to be a problem. I think it's the only way of appropriately having the right kind of continuity between metaphysics and science. So this is me who said, well, you'd reject these kind of requirements on accounts of chance, such as proving the principle without using chance-based reasoning. Instead, we can use chances in characterizing the relation between chance and actual events and showing how chance plays its role. It's all fine. Okay, I don't expect that to have convinced anyone, but just to say, there is a positive story which I think comes out of this worries for what the Humean is going to say about these cases. Okay, and I will finish it there. Yes.